meeting, and so I had to come to the library where they have Wi-Fi, and I have to be outside because so I don't disturb anybody. So
Oh,
Oh,
my car.
I know that. I know that scene.
So Duncan, how come we're skipping back a little bit? I'm just curious.
Only because I think it'll give us other people a better sense, and even ourselves a better sense of where we are. And there's a couple of lines in here which are extremely important,
Okay.
where he is not upset with the people who are tormenting him. And then there's the whole scene with the girl, the image of the girl, which I think is important.
Okay.
So forgive me if I seem arbitrary. I am stumbling along in the best I can.
You're doing a great job stumbling.
Okay, so whoever may be watching this on the YouTube live video later, we're continuing Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man. Stephen has just, he's being tormented by some people he thought were friends because he likes Lord Byron and they think that's scandalous. And now they're trying to get him to denounce Lord Byron, and he refuses. All right, off we go. While he was still repeating the Confiteor amid the indulgent laughter of his hearers, and while the scenes of that malignant episode were still passing sharply and swiftly before his mind, he wondered why he bore no malice now to those who had tormented him. He had not forgotten a whit of their cowardice and cruelty, but the memory of it called forth no anger from him. All the description of fierce love and hatred which he had met in books had seemed to him therefore unreal. Even that night, as he stumbled homewards along Jones's Road, he felt that some power was divesting him of that sudden woven anger as easily as a fruit is divested of its soft, ripe peel. Next, please.
He remained standing with his two companions at the end of the shed, listening idly to their talk or to the bursts of applause in the theater. She was sitting there among the others, perhaps waiting for him to appear. He tried to recall her appearance, but could not. He could remember only that she had worn a shawl about her head like a cow, and that her dark eyes had invited and unnerved him. He wondered, had he been in her thoughts as she had been in his? Then in the dark and unseen by the other two, he rested the tips of the fingers of one hand upon the palm of the other hand, scarcely touching it lightly. But the pressure of her fingers had been lighter and steadier, and suddenly the memory of their touch traversed his brain and body like an invisible wave. A boy came towards them, running along under the shed. He was excited and breathless. Next, please.
Oh, Daedalus, he cried, Doyle is in a great bake about you. You're to go on at once and get dressed for the play. Hurry up, you better. He's coming now, said Heron to the messenger with a haughty drawl. When he wants to. The boy turned to Heron and repeated, but Doyle is in an awful bake. Will you tell Doyle, with my best compliments, that I damned his eyes? Answered Heron. Well, I must go now, said Stephen, who cared little for such points of honor. I wouldn't, said Heron. Damn me if I would. That's no way to send for one of the senior boys. In a bake, indeed. I think it's quite enough that you're taking a part in this bally old play. The spirit of quarrelsome comradeship which he had observed lately in his rival had not seduced Stephen from his habits of quiet obedience. He mistrusted the turbulence and doubted the sincerity of such comradeship, which seemed to him a sorry anticipation of manhood. The question of honor here raised was, like all such questions, trivial to him. While his mind had been pursuing his intangible phantoms and turning in irresolution from such pursuit. He had heard about him the constant voices of his father and of his masters, urging him to be a gentleman above all things, and urging him to be a good Catholic above all things. These voices had now come to be hollow sounding in his ears. When the gymnasium had been opened, he had heard another voice urging him to be strong and manly and healthy. And when the movement towards national revival had begun to be felt in the college, yet another voice had bidden him to be true to his country and help to raise up her language and tradition. In the profane world, as he foresaw, a worldly voice would bid him to raise up his father's fallen state by his labors, and meanwhile, the voice of his school comrades urged him to be a decent fellow, to shield others from blame, or to beg them off, and to do his best to get free days for the school. And it was the din of all these hollow-sounding voices that made him halt irresolutely in the pursuit of phantoms. He gave them ear only for a time, but he was happy only when he was far from them, beyond their call, alone or in the company of phantasmal comrades. Next, please.
In the vestry, a plump, fresh-faced Jesuit and an elderly man in shabby blue clothes were dabbling in a case of paints and chalks. The boys who had been painted, walked about or stood still awkwardly, touching their faces in a gingerly fashion with their furtive fingertips. In the middle of the vestry, a young Jesuit, who was then on a visit to the college, stood rocking himself rhythmically from the tips of his toes to his heels and back again, his hands pressed well forward into his side pockets. His small head set off with glossy red curls, and his newly shaven face agreed well with the spotless decency of his soutane and with his spotless shoes. As he watched the swaying form and tried to read for himself the legend of the priest's mocking smile, there came into Stephen's memory a saying which he had heard from his father before he had been sent to Glengouse, that you could always tell a Jesuit by the style of his clothes. At the same moment, he thought he saw a likeness between his father's mind and that of this smiling, well-dressed priest, and he was aware of some desecration of the priest's office or of the vestry itself, whose silence was now routed by loud talk and joking, and its air pungent with the smells of gas jets and the grease. Next.
While his forehead was being wrinkled and his jaws painted black and blue by the elderly man, he listened distractedly to the voice of the plump young Jesuit, which bade him speak up and make his points clearly. He could hear the band playing the Lily of Killarney, and he knew that in a few moments the curtain would go up. He felt no stage fright, but the thought of the part he had to play humiliated him. A remembrance of some of his lines made a sudden flush rise to his painted cheek. He saw her serious, alluring eyes watching him from among the audience, and their image at once swept away his scruples, leaving his will compact. Another nature seemed to have been lent him. The infection of the excitement and youth about him entered into and transformed his moody mistrustfulness. For one rare moment, he seemed to be clothed in the real apparel of boyhood, and as he stood in the wings among the other players, he shared the common mirth, amid which the drop scene was hauled upwards by two able-bodied priests, with violent jerks and all awry. A few moments after, he found himself on the stage amid the garish gas of the dim scenery, acting before the innumerable faces of the void. It surprised him to see that the play, which he had known at rehearsals for a disjointed, lifeless thing, had suddenly assumed a life of its own. It seemed now to play itself, he and his fellow actors aiding it with their parts. When the curtain fell on the last scene, the void filled with applause, and through a rift in the side scene, saw the simple body before which he had acted magically deformed, the void of faces breaking at all points and falling asunder into busy groups. He left the stage quickly and rid himself of his mummery and passed out through the chapel into the college garden. Now that the play was over, his nerves cried for some further adventure. He hurried onwards as if to overtake it. The doors of the theatre were all open, and the audience had emptied out. On the lines which he had fancied the moorings of an ark, a few lanterns swung in the night breeze, flickering cheerlessly. He mounted the steps from the garden in haste, eager that some prey should not elude him, and forced his way through the crowd in the hall and past the Jesuits who stood watching the exodus and bowing and shaking hands with their visitors. He pushed onward nervously, feigning a still greater haste, and faintly conscious of the smiles and stares and nudges which his powdered head left in its wake. Next, please.
When he came out on the steps, he saw his family waiting for him at the first lamp. In a glance, he noticed that every figure of the group was familiar and ran down the steps angrily. I have to leave a message down in Georgia Street, he said to his father quickly. I'll be home after you. Without waiting for his father's questions, he ran across the road and began to walk at breakneck speed down the hill. He hardly knew where he was walking. Pride and hope and desire, like crushed herbs in his heart, sent up vapors of maddening incense before the eyes of his mind. He strode down the hill amid the tumult of sudden risen vapors of wounded pride and fallen hope and baffled desire. They streamed upwards before his anguished eyes in dense and maddening fumes and passed away from him till at last the air was clear and cold again. A film still veiled his eyes, but they burned no longer. A power akin to that which had often made anger or resentment fall from him brought his steps to rest. He stood still and gazed at the somber porch of the morgue, and from that to the dark cobbled laneway at its side. He saw the word "Lots" on the walls of the lane and breathed slowly the rank, heavy air. That is horse piss and rotted straw, he thought. It is a good odor to breathe. It will calm my heart. My heart is quite calm now. I will go back. Next, please.
Stephen was once again seated beside his father in the corner of a railway carriage at Kingsbridge. He was traveling with his father by the night mail to Cork. As the train steamed out of the station, he recalled his childish wonder of years before and every event of his first day in Clongowes. But he felt no wonder now. He saw the darkening land slipping past him, the silent telegraph poles passing his window swiftly every 4 seconds, the little glimmering stations manned by a few silent sentries, flung by the mail behind her, and twinkling for a moment in the darkness like fiery grains flung backwards by a runner. He listened without sympathy to his father's evocation of Cork and of scenes of his youth, a tale broken by sighs or draughts from his pocket flask whenever the image of some dead friend appeared in it, or whenever the evoker remembered suddenly the purpose of his actual visit. Stephen heard, but could feel no pity. The images of the dead were all strange to him, save that of Uncle Charles, an image which had lately been fading out of his memory. He knew, however, that his father's property was going to be sold by auction, and in the manner of his own dispossession, he felt the world give the lie rudely to his fantasy. Next.
At Maryborough, he fell asleep. When he awoke, the train had passed out of Mallow, and his father was stretched asleep on the other seat. The cold light of dawn lay over the country, over the unpeopled fields and the closed cottages. The terror of sleep fascinated his mind as he watched the silent country or heard from time to time his father's deep breath or sudden sleepy movement. The neighborhood of unseen sleepers filled him with strange dread, as though they could harm him, and he prayed that the day might come quickly. His prayer, addressed neither to God nor saint, began with a shiver as the chilly morning breeze crept through the chink of the carriage door to his feet, and ended in a trail of foolish words which he made to fit the insistent rhythm of the train. And silently, at intervals of 4 seconds, the telegraph poles held the galloping notes of the music between the punctual bars, This furious music allayed his dread, and leaning against the window ledge, he let his eyelids close again. Next, please.
He drove in a jingle across the park, while it was still early morning, and Stephen finished his sleep in a bedroom of the Victoria Hotel. The bright warm sunlight was streaming through the window, and he could hear the din of traffic. His father was standing before the dressing table, examining his hair and face and mustache with great care, craning his neck across the water jug and drawing it back sideways to see the better. While he did so, he sang softly to himself, with quaint accent and phrasing. This youth and folly makes young men merry, so here, my love, I'll no longer stay. What can be cured, sure, must be injured, sure, so I'll go to America. My love, she's handsome, my love, she's bonny. She's like good whiskey when it is new, but when it is old and growing cold, it fades and dies like the Mountain Dew. Next, please.
Consciousness of the warm, sunny city outside his window, and the tender tremors with which his father's voice festooned the strange, sad, happy air, drove off all the mist of the night's ill humor from Stephen's brain. He got up quickly to dress, and when the song had ended, said, "That's much prettier than any of your other come-all-yous." "Do you think so?" asked Mr. Dedalus. "I like it," said Stephen. "It's a pretty old air," said Mr. Dedalus, twirling the points of his mustache. "Ah, but you should have heard Mick Lacy sing it. Poor Mick Lacy. He had little turns for it, grace notes he used to put in it I haven't got. That was the boy who could sing a Come All You If You Like." Mr. Dedalus had ordered Dressines for breakfast, and during the meal he cross-examined the waiter for local news. For the most part, they spoke at cross purposes when a name was mentioned, the waiter having in mind the present holder, and Mr. Dedalus, his father, or perhaps his grandfather. Next, please.
Well, I hope they haven't moved the Queen's College anyhow, said Mr. Dedalus, for I want to show it to the youngster of mine. Along the Mardyke, the trees were in bloom. They entered the grounds of the college and were led by the garrulous porter across the quadrangle. But their progress across the gravel was brought to a halt after every dozen or so paces by some reply of the porters. "Ah, do you tell me so? And is poor Pottlebelly dead?" "Yes, sir, dead, sir." During these halts, Stephen stood awkwardly behind the two men, weary of the subject and waiting restlessly for the slow march to begin. By the time they had crossed the quadrangle, his restlessness had risen to fever. He wondered how his father, whom he knew for a shrewd, suspicious man, could be duped by the servile manners of the porter, and the lively southern speech which had entertained him all the morning now irritated his ears. They passed into the Anatomy Theater, where Mr. Dedalus, the porter aiding him, searched the desks for his initials. Stephen remained in the background, depressed more than ever by the darkness and silence of the theater and by the air it wore of jaded and formal study. On the desk he read the words, "Photis," cut several times in the dark-stained wood. The sudden legend startled his blood. He seemed to feel the absent students of the college about him and to shrink from their company. A vision of their life, which his father's words had been powerless to evoke, sprang up before him out of the word cut in the desk. Next, please.
A broad-shouldered student with a mustache was cutting in the letters with a jackknife seriously. Other students stood or sat near him, laughing at his handiwork. One jogged his elbow. The big student turned on him, frowning. He was dressed in loose gray clothes and had tan boots. Stephen's name was called. Hurrying down the steps of the theater so as to be far away from the vision as he could be, and peering closely at his father's initials hid his flushed face. But the word and the vision capered before his eyes as he walked back across the quadrangle and towards the college gate. It shocked him to find in the outer world a trace of what he had deemed till then a brutish and individual malady of his own mind. His monstrous reveries came thronging into his memory. They too had sprung up before him, suddenly and furiously, out of mere words. He had soon given in to them, and allowed them to sweep across and abase his intellect, wondering always where they came from what den of monstrous images, and always weak and humble towards others, restless and sickened of himself when they had swept over him. "Aye, bedad, and there's the groceries, sure enough," cried Mr. Dedalus. "You often heard me speak of the groceries, didn't you, Stephen? Many's the time we went down there when our names had been marked. Crowd of us, Harry Paird and little Jack Mountain and Bob Dias and Maurice Moriarty, the Frenchman, and Tom O'Grady and Mick Lacey that I told you of this morning, and Joey Corbett and poor little good-hearted Johnny Keevers of the Tantiles." Next, please.
The leaves of the trees along the Mardyke were astir and whispering in the sunlight. A team of cricketers passed, agile young men in flannels and blazers, one of them carrying the long green wicket bag. In a quiet by-street, a German band of 5 players in faded uniforms and with battered brass instruments was playing to an audience of street Arabs and leisurely messenger boys. A maid in a white cap and apron was watering a box of plants on a sill which shone like a slab of limestone in the warm glare. From another window open to the air came the sound of a piano, scale after scale, rising into the treble. Stephen walked on at his father's side, listening to the stories he had heard before, hearing again the names of the scattered and dead revelers who had been the companions of his father's youth. And a faint sickness sighed in his heart. He recalled his own equivocal position in Belvedere, a free boy, a leader afraid of his own authority, proud and sensitive and suspicious, battling against the squalor of his life and against the riot of his mind. The letters cut in the stained wood of the desk stared upon him, mocking his bodily weakness and futile youth enthusiasms, and making him loathe himself for his own mad and filthy orgies. The spittle in his throat grew bitter and foul to swallow, and the faint sickness clung to his brain, so that for a moment he closed his eyes and walked on in darkness. He could still hear his father's voice. Next.
We don't appear to have Orla on our list. Orla, do you want to come in there?
It's fine. It's fine.
No,
Orla's
I'm not reading this one, so it's okay. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, when you kick out for yourself, Stephen, as I dare say you will one of these days, remember, whatever you do, to mix with gentlemen. When I was a young fellow, I tell you, I enjoyed myself. I mixed with fine, decent fellows. Every one of us could do something. One fellow had a good voice, another fellow was a good actor, another could sing a good comic song, another was a good oarsman or a good racket player, another could tell a story, and so on. We kept the ball rolling anyhow and enjoyed ourselves and saw a bit of life. And we were none the worse of it either. But we were all gentlemen, Stephen. At least I hope we were. And bloody good, honest Irishmen too. That's the kind of fellows I want you to associate with. Fellows of the right kidney. I'm talking to you as a friend, Stephen. I don't believe in playing the stern father. I don't believe a son should be afraid of his father. No, I treat you as your grandfather treated me when I was a young chap. We were more like brothers than father and son. I'll never forget the first day he caught me smoking. I was standing at the end of the South Terrace one day with some Manings, like myself. And sure, we thought we were grandfellows because we had pipes stuck in the corners of our mouths. Suddenly the governor passed, didn't say a word or stop even, but the next day, Sunday, we were out for a walk together. And when we were coming home, He took out his cigar case and said, "By the by, Stephen, I didn't know you smoked," or something like that. Of course, I tried to carry it off as best I could. "If you want a good smoke," he said, "try one of these cigars. An American captain made me a present of them last night in Queenstown." Next, please.
Stephen heard his father's voice break into a laugh, which was almost a sob. He was the most handsomest man in Cork at that time, by God he was. The woman used to stand to look after him in the street. He heard the sob passing loudly down his father's throat and opened his eyes with a nervous impulse. The sunlight breaking suddenly on his sight turned the sky and clouds into a fantastic world of somber masses, like lake-like spaces of dark rosy light. His very brain was sick and powerless. He could scarcely interpret the letters of the signboards of the shops. By his monstrous way of life, he seemed to have put himself beyond the limits of reality. Nothing moved him or spoke to him from the real world unless he heard it in an echo of the infuriated cries within him. He could respond to no earthly or human appeal, dumb and insensible to the call of summer and gladness and companionship, wearied and dejected by his father's voice. He could scarcely recognize as his own thoughts and repeated slowly to himself, "I am Stephen Dedalus. I am walking beside my father, whose name is Simon Dedalus. We are in Cork, in Ireland. Cork is a city. Our room is in the Victoria Hotel. Victoria and Stephen and Simon. Simon and Stephen and Victoria. Names." The memory of his childhood suddenly grew dim. He tried to call forth some of his vivid moments, but could not. He recalled only names. Dante, Parnell, Clane, Clongowes. The little boy had been taught geography by an old woman who kept 2 brushes in her wardrobe. Then he had been sent away from home to college. In the college, he had made his first communion and eaten Slim Jim out of his cricket cap and watched the firelight leaping and dancing on the wall of a little bedroom in the infirmary and dreamed of being dead, of mass being set for him by the rector in a black and gold cope, of being buried then in the little graveyard of the community off the main avenue of limes. But he had not died then. Parnell had died. There had been no mass for the dead in the chapel and no procession. He had not died, but he had faded out like a film in the sun. He had been lost or had wandered out of existence, for he no longer existed. How strange to think of him passing out of existence in such a way, not by death, but by fading out in the sun or by being lost and forgotten somewhere in the universe. It was strange to see his small body appear again for a moment, a little boy in a gray belted suit. His hands were in his side pockets and his trousers were tucked in at the knees by elastic bands. Next, please.
On the evening of the day on which the property was sold, Stephen followed his father meekly about the city from bar to bar, to the sellers in the market, to the barmen and barmaids, to the beggars who importuned him for a lob. Mr. Dedalus told the same tale, that he was an old Corkonian, that he had been trying for 30 years to get rid of his Cork accent up in Dublin, and that Peter Fox beside him was his eldest son, but that he was only a Dublin Jackeen. They had set out early in the morning from Newcomb's coffee house, where Mr. Dedalus's cup had rattled noisily against its saucer, and Stephen had tried to cover that shameful sign of his father's drinking bout of the night before by moving his chair and coughing. One humiliation has succeeded another. The false smiles of the market sellers, the curvetings and oglings of the barmaids with whom his father flirted, the compliments and encouraging words of his father's friends. They had told him that he had a great look of his grandfather, and Mr. Dedalus had agreed that he was an ugly likeness. They had unearthed traces of a Cork accent in his speech and made him admit that the Lee was a much finer river than the Liffey. One of them, in order to put his Latin to the proof, had made him translate the short passage from the Lectus and asked him whether it was correct to say tempora mutador nos e mutador in Ilias or tempora mutador e nos mutamor in Ilias. Another, a brisk old man whom Mr. Daedalus called Johnny Cashman, had covered him with confusion by asking him to say which were prettier, the Dublin girls or the Cork girls. He's not that way built, said Mr. Daedalus. Leave him alone. He's a level-headed thinking boy who doesn't bother his head about that kind of nonsense. Next.
Then he's not his father's son, said the little old man. I don't know, I'm sure, said Mr. Daedalus, smiling complacently. Your father, said the little old man to Stephen, was the boldest flirt in the city of Cork in his day. Do you know that? Stephen looked down and studied the tiled floor of the bar into which they had drifted. Now don't be putting ideas into his head, said Mr. Daedalus. Leave him to his maker. Yara, sure, I wouldn't put any ideas into his head. I am old enough to be his grandfather. And I am a grandfather, said the little old man to Stephen. Do you know that? Are you? Asked Stephen. Bedad I am, said the little old man. I have 2 bouncing grandchildren out on Sundays. Well, now then, what age do you think I am? And I remember seeing your grandfather in his red coat riding out to hounds. That was before you were born. Aye, or thought of, said Mr. Daedalus. Bedad, I did, repeat the little old man, and more than that, I can remember even your great-grandfather, old John Stephen Daedalus, and a fierce old fire-eater he was. Now then, there's a memory for you. That's 3 generations, 4 generations, and another of the company. Why, Johnny Cashman, you must be nearing the century. Well, I'll tell you the truth, said the little old man. I'm just 27 years of age. We're as old as we feel, Johnny, said Mr. Daedalus. And just finish what you have there, and we'll have another. Here, Tim or Tom or whatever your name is, give us the same again here, by God. I don't feel more than 18 myself. There's that son of mine. They're not half my age, and I'm a better man than he is any day of the week. Next, please.
Throw it mild now, Daedalus. I think it's time for you to take a back seat, said the gentleman who had spoken before. No, by God, asserted Mr. Daedalus. I sing a tenor song against him, or I bolt a 5-barrel game against him, or I run with him after the hounds across the country, as I did 30 years ago along with the fairy boy and the best man for it. But he'll beat you here, said the little old man, tapping his forehead and raising his glass to drain it. Well, I hope he'll be as good a man as his father. That's all I can say, said Mr. Daedalus. If he is, he'll do, said the little old man. And thanks to be God, Johnny, said Mr. Daedalus, that we lived so long and did so little harm. But did so much good, Simon, said the little old man gravely. Thanks be to God, we lived so long and did so much good. Next, please.
Stephen watched the 3 glasses being raised from the counter as his father and his 2 cronies drank to the memory of their past. An abyss of fortune or of temperament sundered him from them. His mind seemed older than theirs. It shone coldly on their strifes and happiness and regrets like a moon upon a younger earth. No life or use stirred in him as it had stirred in them. He had known neither the pleasure of companionship with others, nor the vigor of rude male health, nor filial piety. Nothing stirred within his soul but a cold and cool and loveless lust. His childhood was dead or lost, and with it his soul capable of simple joys. And he was drifting amid life like the barren shell of the moon. Art thou pale for weariness of climbing heaven and gazing on the earth, wandering companionless? He repeated to himself the lines of Shelley's fragment. Its alternation of sad human ineffectualness with the vast inhuman cycles of activity chilled him, and he forgot his own human and ineffectual grieving. Next, please.
Stephen's mother and his brother and one of his cousins waited at the corner of quiet Foster Place while he and his father went up the steps and along the colonnade where the Highland sentry was parading. When they had passed into the great hall and stood at the counter, Stephen drew forth his orders on the governor of the Bank of Ireland for 30 and £3, and these sums, the moneys of his exhibition and essay prize, were paid over to him rapidly by the teller in notes and in coin respectively. He bestowed them in his pockets with feigned composure and suffered the friendly teller, to whom his father chatted, to take his hand across the broad counter and wish him a brilliant career in afterlife. He was impatient of their voices and could not keep his feet at rest. But the teller still deferred the serving of others to say that he was living in changed times and that there was nothing like giving the boy the best education that money could buy. Mr. Dedalus lingered in the hall, gazing about him and up at the roof and telling Stephen, who urged him to come out, that they were standing in the House of Commons of the old Irish Parliament. God help us, he said piously, to think of the men of those times, Stephen, Helly Hutchinson and Flood and Henry Grattan and Charles Kendall Bush, and the noblemen we have now, leaders of the Irish people at home and abroad. Why, by God, they wouldn't be seen dead in a 10-acre field with them. No, Stephen, old chap, I'm sorry to say that they are only as I roved out one fine May morning in the merry month of sweet July. Next, please.
A keen October wind was blowing round the bank. The three figures standing at the edge of the muddy path had pinched cheeks and watery eyes. Stephen looked at his thinly clad mother and remembered that a few days before he had seen a mantle priced at 20 guineas in the windows of Barnardo's. Well, that's done, said Mr. Dedalus. We had better go to dinner, said Stephen. Where? Dinner, said Mr. Dedalus. Well, I suppose we had better, what? Someplace that's not too dear, said Mrs. Dedalus. Underdone's? Yes, some quiet place. Come along, said Stephen quickly. It doesn't matter about the dearness. He walked on before them with short, nervous steps, smiling. They tried to keep up with him, smiling also at his eagerness. Take it easy like a good young fellow, said his father. We're not out for the half-mile, are we? For a swift season of merrymaking, the money of his prizes ran through Stephen's fingers. Next, please.
Great parcels of groceries and delicacies and dried fruits arrived from the city. Every day he drew up a bill of fare for the family, and every night led a party of 3 or 4 to the theater to see Ingomar or Lady of Lions. In his coat pockets, he carried squares of Vienna chocolate for his guests, while his trousers pockets bulged with masses of silver and copper coins. He bought presents for everyone, overhauled his room, wrote out resolutions, marshaled his books up and down the shelves, pored upon all kinds of price lists, drew up a form of commonwealth for the household by which every member of it held some office, opened a loan bank for his family, and pressed loans on willing borrowers so that he might have the pleasure of making out receipts and reckoning the interests on the sums lent. When he could do no more, he drove up and down the city in tramps. Then the season of pleasure came to an end. The pot of pink enamel paint gave out, and the wainscot of his bedroom remained with its unfinished and ill-plastered coat. His household returned to its usual way of life. His mother had no further occasion to upbraid him for squandering his money. He too returned to his old life at school, and all his novel enterprises fell to pieces. The Commonwealth fell. The loan bank closed its coffers and its books on a sensible loss. The rules of life which he had drawn about himself fell into desuetude. Next.
How foolish his aim had been. He had tried to build a breakwater of order and elegance against the sordid tide of life without him, and to dam up by rules of conduct and active interests and new filial relations the powerful recurrence of the tides within him. Useless. From without, as from within, the water had flowed over his barriers. Their tides began once more to jostle fiercely above the crumbled mole. He saw clearly, too, his own futile isolation. He had not gone one step nearer the lives he had sought to approach, nor bridged the restless shame and rancor that divided him from mother and brother and sister. He felt that he was hardly of one blood with them, but stood to them rather in the mystical kinship of fosterage, foster child, and foster brother. He burned to appease the fierce longings of his heart, before which everything else was idle and alien. He cared little that he was in mortal sin, that his life had grown to be a tissue of subterfuge and falsehood. Beside the savage desire within him to realize the enormities which he brooded on, nothing was sacred. He bore cynically the shameful details of his secret riots in which he had exulted, to defile with patience whatever image had attracted his eyes. By day and by night, he moved among distorted images of the outer world. A figure that had seemed to him by day demure and innocent came towards him by night through the winding darkness of sleep, her face transfigured by a lecherous cunning, her eyes bright with brutish joy. Only the morning pained him with its dim memory of dark orgiastic riot, its keen and humiliating sense of transgression. He returned to his wanderings. The veiled autumnal evenings led him from street to street, as they had led him years before along the quiet avenues of Blackrock. But no vision of trim front gardens or of kindly lights in the windows poured a tender influence upon him now. Only at times, in the pauses of his desire, when the luxury that was wasting him gave room to a softer languor, the image of Mercedes traversed the background of his memory. He saw again the small white house and the garden of rose bushes on the road that led to the mountains, and he remembered the sadly proud gesture of refusal which he was to make there, standing with her in the moonlight garden after years of estrangement and adventure. At these moments, the soft speeches of Claude Melnotte rose to his lips and eased his unrest. A tender premonition touched him of the tryst he had then looked forward to, and in spite of the horrible reality which lay between his hope of then and now, of the holy encounter he had then imagined, at which weakness and timidity and inexperience were to fall from him. Next, please.
Such moments passed, and the wasting fires of lust sprang up again. The verses passed from his lips, and the inarticulate cries and the unspoken brutal words rushed forth from his brain to force a passage. His blood was in revolt. He wandered up and down the dark, slimy streets, peering into the gloom of lanes and doorways, listening eagerly for any sound. He moaned to himself like some baffled, prowling beast. He wanted to sin with another of his kind, to force another being to sin with him and to exult with her in sin. He felt some dark presence moving irresistibly upon him from the darkness, a presence subtle and murmurous as a flood filling him wholly with itself. Its murmur besieged his ears like the murmur of some multitude in sleep. Its subtle streams penetrated his being. His hands clenched convulsively and his teeth set together as he suffered the agony of its penetration. He stretched out his arms in the street to hold fast the frail, swooning form that eluded him and incited him, and the cries that he had strangled for so long in his throat issued from his lips. It broke from him like a wall of despair from a hell of sufferers and died in a wail of furious entreaty, a cry for the iniquitous abandonment, the cry which was but the echo of an obscene scrawl which he had read on the oozing walls of a urinal. Next, please.
He had wandered into a maze of narrow and dirty streets. From the foul laneways, he heard bursts of hoarse riot and wrangling and the drawling of drunken singers. He walked onward, undismayed, wondering whether he had strayed into the quarter of the Jews. Women and girls dressed in long, vivid gowns traversed the street from house to house. They were leisurely and perfumed. A trembling seized him, and his eyes grew dim. The yellow gas flames arose before his troubled vision against the vapory sky, burning as if before an altar. Before the doors and in the lighted halls, groups were gathered, arrayed as for some rite. He was in another world. He had awakened from a slumber of centuries. He stood still in the middle of the roadway, his heart clamoring against his bosom in a tumult. A young woman dressed in a long pink gown laid her hand on his arm and to detain him and gazed into his face. She said gaily, "Good night, Willie dear." Her room was warm and lightsome. A huge doll sat with her legs apart in the copious easy chair beside the bed. He tried to bid his tongue speak, that he might seem at ease, watching her as she undid her gown, noting the proud, conscious movements of her perfumed head. As he stood silent in the middle of the room, she came over to him and embraced him gaily and gravely. Her round arms held him firmly to her, and he, seeing her face lifted to him in serious calm and feeling the warm calm rise and fall of her breast, all but burst into hysterical weeping. Tears of joy and relief shone on his delighted eyes, and his lips parted, though they would not speak. Next.
She passed her tinkling hand through his hair, calling him a little rascal. "Give me a kiss," she said. His lips would not bend to kiss her. He wanted to be held firmly in her arms, to be caressed slowly, slowly, slowly. In her arms, he felt that he had suddenly become strong and fearless and sure of himself. But his lips would not bend to kiss her. With a sudden movement, she bowed his head and joined her lips to his, and he read the meaning of her movements in her frank, uplifted eyes. It was too much for him. He closed his eyes, surrendering himself to her, body and mind, conscious of nothing in the world but the dark pressure of her softly parting lips. They pressed upon his brain as upon his lips, as though they were the vehicle of a vague speech. And between them he felt an unknown and timid pressure, darker than the swoon of sin, softer than the sound or odor. End of chapter 2.
End of chapter 2. We should probably take a breath. That's a lot of movement there.
Yeah.
Since we started with Heron, and he's gained an age and emotions, and there's a lot that's happened. It's really like a rushing river.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty incredible. So
the writing is so absolutely, totally amazing.
That's what I was going to comment on too. The writing that describes all of his emotions and actions and time past and memory and relations with his father. It's incredible writing.
Yeah. And as I said, it covers so much
Mm-hmm.
in a very short period of reading. It's just like breathtaking.
Yes.
Okay.
So how old would you say Stephen is in this passage that we just read? What he was through several years, I assume.
Well, he had already won his prize.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. 16, 17, 18?
16 or 17, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Wasn't it amazing what he thought he could accomplish with spending the prize money? all the gifts to the family, hoping the past was past and he would have resolved all the issues between family members, and he would be living on a higher plane with the dinners that would, and the gifts of food.
I think that part is interesting as well, because those are Stephen's ideations. And then when we look at how things actually wound up for Joyce, he was certainly not on the lending side of the situation, like Daedalus fantasizes being.
Though he was, according to all reports, generous, though with other people's money. I mean, he would encourage everybody to join in and have a drink, even though he wasn't paying for it necessarily. But I think that scheme of his points to maybe a younger age than even 16, maybe 14, 15. But could be wrong.
I love the idea too of how his father is trying to continue to portray himself as like debonair and incompetent. He's not going to cry about losing all the property in Cork. He's going to be out drinking and putting on a facade that things are going well for him.
Well, I mean, his father, that's Stephen, with his prize money, is kind of imitating his father in that way. And when his father does get a hold of money, I mean, everything is right in the world, and it seemingly will last forever. And that's an easy trap to fall into. Yeah.
Well,
I was amazed again to see Mercedes popping up, that the fictional character Mercedes really had such a strong grip on him. I guess I'm going to have to read the Count of Monte Cristo at some point.
But I think it has to do with reading that at a certain age that made such an impression on him. And that's an experience I think all of us who are readers have had. A book meant something in our youth that really, really caught us and impressed us.
Yeah, I will have to say I got caught very much by From Here to Eternity, which of course also came out as a movie, and the movie is very, very good as well. And I got at the age of like 15 or 16, I really got caught by that, particularly by the characters of Pruitt and Frank Sinatra's character.
I think it's not just youth that happens to. I think no matter how old you are, if you're reading something that strikes you because of what is happening in your own life at the time, that it stands out and becomes very prominent in your life at the time.
Yeah,
I've had that experience.
I know, absolutely. I mean, it's not something that you lose as you. But I think the first time it happens, when you're young, it makes maybe I'm not going to say it makes a stronger impression, but it's something that you certainly remember, as Joyce did or as Stephen did.
For me, it was Jane Eyre. I was lazily reading the book, laying down on the sofa, and then they go to the church to get married, and the question is there an impediment to the marriage with Rochester? It never crossed my mind that there could be a problem with this romantic notion that she's marrying the boss. I just sat bolt upright. Oh my God, a book can do this to you.
Yeah. Well, of course, the master course in that, although not all agree, is Don Quixote. Where he just becomes fevered by all the tales. So, Yep. Okay, shall we move on just a little bit into the next chapter? Or shall we stop here?
I think we should stop.
You want to stop? Okay,
I agree.
Yeah, I think things become a unit, and when you like when I came in the middle of a unit today,
yes, you did.
it's difficult, and you miss something.
Mhm.
I've got to go back and read it all over again.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it will certainly make it easy for everyone to find where we start next time. There is that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Duncan. It's just extraordinary to read together and
Yes,
ponder the meanings and beauty of the writing. And
it's
yeah,
wonderful. Yeah, I agree.
It's a
Wonderful.
wonderful book. Wonderful book.
Yeah.
I think there's probably more than one air that the song goes to, and maybe Donna knows another one, but that "'Tis Youth and Folly" is one of the older songs.
Oh, yeah.
And
Can you sing it for us? Can you sing
I
it for
lost you
us?
guys there for a while.
I can try it to one of the airs that I know.
Okay.
No,
Good.
please.
"'Tis youth and folly makes young men merry. So here, my love, I'll no longer stay." I've got it all wrong. What can't be cured, sure, must be endured, sure. So I will go to America. I've got it wrong.
Now it fades and
My love,
dies.
she's handsome. My love, she's bonny. She's like good whiskey when it is new. But when 'tis old, dear, and growing cold, dear, it fades and dies like the mountain dew. Something like that. I apologize.
It's from an anonymous ballad called "Love is Pleasing, Love is Teasing."
Love is pleasing, love is teasing, right?
And I can't recall the year of it. Certainly not after you've sung. I can't pick it up.
I
but
apologize for that.
it's mhm. Go ahead, Bill.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say within the two stanzas, you have the movement of time from youth to the reality of aging and losing.
Well, after 3, I thought I'd give you a call now and see if you're.
Oh, okay. Jones answering machine. Yes, well, what is that Frank Sinatra song? It does the same thing, probably not as well, but it was a good song anyway.
That
You don't mean when I was 17, do you? Because I wouldn't call that a Frank Sinatra song.
I was.
Yeah, well, yeah.
A very good year.
Growing older.
That's
Mhm.
a very good year.
Wasn't that Peter and Gordon though, or who was it that sang that?
Somebody famous.
Sinatra definitely sang it. I don't know who wrote
Oh
it.
yeah.
I thought it was much earlier than Peter and Gordon, though.
No,
Wasn't
it's not an old song at all. It's a 60s
Really?
British
Mm.
pop group that wrote when I was 17.
Mhm.
It was a very good year.
That was a very good year. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It was one of those famous people.
That narrows it down a bit.
It might have been Joni Mitchell or somebody like that,
Not Joni Mitchell.
but somebody like that.
I'm gonna have to look in my machine.
Yeah, Google could answer it.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask on page 67 in Wordsworth, the song, what can't be cured, sure, I thought it was must be endured, and it says injured in this book. Is that a typo, or is it meant to be endured and he's making a point of saying injured?
I think it's just a variant.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like it's such an old song that the lyrics have been changed and altered over time. And at one time it was endured, and then somebody misheard it. It's like a Mondegreen where you mishear the lyrics, and
Mm-hmm.
then the lyrics become the new lyric takes over.
You know, the way you were mentioning earlier that he's being slagged off by the boys. So, you know, what can't be cured, the way he's being treated, must be endured, but he's injured by, or is he not injured? Is he enduring it?
He's actually rising. You talk about with Heron and giving trouble about that. But there's the reason why I wanted to go back a little bit was because there's that line where he's amazed that he's not angry. He's somehow rising above their meanness and pettiness. So in that case, he's not enduring it, and he's not injured by it. He's just kind of amazed. It's just kind of like, what? So it's a very interesting thing. Just like that, right after that, he has the image of the girl, which I guess, I don't know. Is this his fantasy image of Mercedes again? Or is this an actual physical girl that he's expecting to be in the audience?
I think it's Eileen who he expects to be in the audience. And actually, Horan is teasing him about her. You know, they saw her coming in with his father.
Okay.
Beginning, they're saying, "Oh, you know, we got you now. You can't play such a goody two shoes. We know what your story is because we saw her with your old man."
But then what happens at the end of the play? It seemed like to me at the end of the play, he was expecting to see her and she wasn't there.
Yes.
And that was why he was so angry. When he looked down and saw his family, I couldn't figure that out. Why, when he saw his family,
he was upset, but yeah.
Because she wasn't there. It was just his family.
You know, I don't know, Joan, and I think that's actually one of the really interesting parts of Portrait of an Artist is we don't always have fully fleshed out explanations for stuff.
Oh, I'm glad to hear you say that.
We just have reactions to stuff and how he feels about them.
I thought it was interesting that Joyce, who's writing the story, really glosses over the play, the performance. Any other author would have given us scenes from the play or how the kids were doing with the play. We just know there's a play and he's hoping somebody's there. I just thought it was interesting that he made no attempt to convey what the play was, what the experience was of actually being on the stage. I mean, it's like one or two sentences, not even a full sentence when Stephen says his experience, what he's feeling on the stage, and then it just moves on.
Yeah, no, for me, it's almost like he's, you know, if I were to compare it to painting, it's almost like an impressionistic painting, just a few strokes here and there, and then, you know, allows the reader to struggle through or to come up with some sort of image on their own.
It's more likely, I mean, it's very likely that it's just a Christmas pantomime of some kind, and Stephen's playing a real small part in it. But I think it gets across his fevered imagination, and all he can think about is the girl that is going to be out there watching him, and that he's going to see her and talk to her, and what might happen afterwards. He's not really concerned much with the play itself.
Yeah.
I would push back a little bit against that, Bill, because he has that whole thing about how, and when they were rehearsing, it was just bits and pieces, and now that they're doing the whole thing, he feels like there's some sort of transcendent event going on.
The play played itself.
The play plays itself, right? And he hasn't necessarily forgotten the girl, but there are other larger emotions at play. I guess pun intended there. And then it's only afterwards, when he doesn't see her, that we have no explanation of why she's not there at the end, but then his mood shifts, which is very, very human, particularly in a teenager.
But that's exactly the tragedy here, is that he thought if he was in the play and on stage and an actor, that he would have someone waiting for him. There's one line here, and it says, on the lines which he had fancied the moorings of an ark, a few lanterns swung in the night breeze, flickering cheerlessly. It didn't bring him accolades and companionship.
Could have been a complete misunderstanding too. I mean, she may, because he didn't see her with his family, didn't mean she wasn't still there and expected to see him and talk to him. So he lets his emotions get the better of him in that regard. That song, "It Was a Very Good Year," was first recorded in 1961 by the Kingston Trio, and it was written by a guy named Irvin Drake for the Kingston Trio.
Okay. I was a big Kingston Trio fan. Yeah. So there we go.
I think someone else sang it too, as a
Oh,
solo.
a lot of people did.
Yeah.
Frank Sinatra came to it very late.
That's who I remember, I think, is Frank Sinatra.
There is a Sandy, you're gonna have to turn on your mic.
Sorry. I said, for what it's worth, I'm talking to you all from Frank Sinatra's hometown. So
You're in New
There we
Jersey.
go.
I'm in Hoboken, New Jersey. Yeah.
Hoboken, New Jersey. I'm just across the river from you.
Oh, all right. We should meet up.
Yeah. But I think in here there's also the illusion to where he's beginning to recognize how his sometimes his emotions take him too far. He doesn't have any control over that, but it's like in that scene with Heron when they're teasing him, where he's kind of rises above their teasing. So it's kind of intermittent recognition of his powerful emotions.
I think he feels apart from everybody also. I think that's something that keeps him from taking their teasing so much to heart, because he talks about going through life alone and no friends and all this thing.
Teenagers.
Yeah, I think there's more to it than that with him, though, with Stephen.
There is more to it than that, but it is very much a teenager thing.
But I see him as a very isolated person, kind of through his whole life, into Ulysses.
Well, Well, I think that's one of the his meeting up with the prostitute gives him a connection, and I think gives him also some understanding that he's not unique in his desires and in his
Right.
imaginings, his lustful thoughts. You know, he thinks that he's sort of in between. He kind of feels as if he's trapped by his younger self in that he's in sin, that he's a sinner, that he's damned, that he's doomed. And yet on the other hand, he kind of, as a little bit older, his older self feels that can't be true, that there must be that this is a human thing, and it can't be something that would condemn him to eternal damnation. I know we're going to get a great deal more of that when it comes to the retreat.
Mm.
Where
There's-
is that?
Any other reflections or comments?
Chapter.
Well, and one thing it interested me was that this is the first time I think I read that the Uncle Charles had died, but it's just made in passing, you know. But that was a huge part of the earlier part of the story, and the lifestyle they had. He was part of that.
Yeah. There's lots of stuff in here which I haven't noticed before. I you know, this is like probably the first. This is confessional. This is my first complete reading of Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man. I have been doing the Joyce works backwards. Made some early attempts at the various works, but I really only started reading seriously when I joined a Finnegan's Wake group back in 2018. And I did nothing but Finnegan's Wake for 3 years until COVID hit. And when COVID hit, then I joined the Sweeney's group, and they were halfway through Portrait of an Artist when I got involved in the Sweeney's readings. So there's a lot of stuff going on in here for me. And I really realize how incredibly layered it is. And like almost everything that Joyce reads, one reading, even one really thorough reading, is just not enough.
Right.
There's just too many layers, and there's too many subtleties in it. So,
We'll have to work you back, Duncan, to Stephen Hero. So
I think that our next book should be Stephen Hero.
Stephen Hero?
Yeah.
I would love to read it. I have not read it.
Okay, well, I've got it sitting on my shelf, so.
I do too.
I do too.
I do too.
Okay.
I don't.
Sounds like we can predict the future a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay,
Well,
I have to go.
Yeah, and I'm very full and satiated myself. So thank you all very, very much, and we will
Thank you.
we will
Yeah,
gather
next week.
at the river next Monday.
Excellent.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
That's great. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Lois,
Bye-bye.
Lois.
Yes.
I don't know if you saw, I sent you a private message with my email if you'd like to get in touch, or I can ask Duncan to send it on to you.
I just sent you my email separately in a separate email to
Oh,
your email.
perfect.
All right.
Thank you.
So
Okay,
the
so you
whole
got
world
it.
doesn't know our emails. Thank you.
All right,
Okay,
very
thank you.
good.